along with the shovel, the wooden box, and the bouquet of white hyacinths. Jason began walking away from the cottage, following a narrow path that led toward the cliff's edge. Frank got out of his car and moved through the brush down the slope toward the cottage, staying hidden among the trees. A growing sense of urgency propelled him forward. Frank waited until Jason was a good distance ahead before carefully following him again. The path wound through scrubby pines and flowering shrubs, eventually opening to a secluded overlook with a breathtaking view of the Pacific Ocean. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. From behind a large rock formation, Frank observed as Jason selected a spot near the cliff's edge. The man looked around cautiously, as if making sure he was alone, then began digging with the shovel. The rocky soil resisted his efforts, indicating it had been a long time since the ground had last been disturbed. After digging a hole about 2 feet deep, Jason set aside the shovel and knelt beside the hole. He opened the wooden box and stared at its contents for a long moment. From Frank's hiding spot, Frank couldn't see what was inside, but Jason's expression was thoughtful, almost reverent. His lips moved silently, as if reading or perhaps reliving memories. He shuffled through the papers in his hands, reading each one carefully, taking his time. Finally, Jason closed the box, but before he could secure the lid, a sudden gust of wind swept across the cliff papers. From inside the box were scattered in all directions. Jason cursed and quickly closed the box before more contents could escape, then scrambled to collect the pieces of paper that had blown around the area. Once he had gathered the loose papers, Jason placed the wooden box into the hole. He laid the bouquet of white hyacinths on top, then began filling the hole with soil. He worked methodically, patting down the earth and pouring water over the mound to compact it. When he had finished, Jason stood over the unmarked grave for a long moment. Then, in a voice just loud enough for Frank to hear over the sound of the ocean waves, he spoke. "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. He jerked backward in shock, his foot slipping on loose pebbles. He caught himself against a tree trunk, freezing in place, and clamping his mouth shut to prevent any sound from escaping. His heart hammered so loudly in his chest that he was certain Jason would hear it. Jason's head snapped up, scanning the surrounding brush. "Hello," he called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Is someone there?" Frank remained perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Jason picked up the shovel and walked a few steps toward the brush where Frank was hiding. He paused, listening intently, then took another step forward. Frank pressed himself against the trunk of the tree, praying that the shadows would conceal him after what seemed like an eternity. Jason stepped back. "Just the wind," he muttered, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He cast a more suspicious glance around the area before gathering his supplies, instead of returning the way he had come. Jason walked the perimeter of the clearing, as if making sure no one was watching him. Finally, satisfied, he headed back toward the cottage, the empty water container and trolley in hand. He leaned the shovel against the side of the cottage before he got into his car and left. Frank waited, counting slowly to a H100 red to make sure Jason wasn't coming back. When the area remained quiet, he cautiously emerged from his hiding place. His legs felt weak, but determination drove him forward toward the freshly disturbed earth. He needed to know what was in that box. He needed to know why Jason had spoken his daughter's name over what looked disturbingly like a grave. Frank retrieved the shovel from where Jason had left it by the cottage and returned to the burial site. He began to dig, his movements frantic yet cautious. The soil was still damp and easy to move. Within minutes, he had uncovered the bouquet of white hyacinths, their perfume filling the air as he set them carefully aside. Just as Frank's shovel struck the wooden box, a voice behind him made his blood run cold. I knew someone was out there. I was right. Frank spun around to find Jason, standing a few yards away. His expression, a mixture of rage and triumph. You shouldn't have come back, Jason said, advancing slowly. I saw your car parked up the hill, so I circled back through the woods. What do you think you're doing? Frank gripped the shovel tightly, both as a tool to continue his work and as a potential weapon if needed. I heard you say my daughter's name, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. What have you buried here, Jason? What does Alicia have to do with this? Jason's face contorted. You don't know what you're talking about. You shouldn't be here. Frank turned back to the partially excavated hole, determined to uncover the box. I'm going to find out what's in there. Stop, Jason shouted, pulling out a gun drop, the shovel. Frank immediately raised his hands in the air, and Jason lunged forward, reaching for the shovel. From Jason's hand, Frank swiftly pulled his phone from his pocket. With his free hand, I'm calling the police. They need to see this. Go ahead. Shoot me if you want. I'll be with my daughter again, but I'm one button away from alerting them. With unexpected speed, Jason knocked the phone from Frank's hand, sending it sliding dangerously close to the cliff's edge. No! Frank shouted. He lunged forward, kicking the gun from Jason's hand and sending it tumbling over the cliff. Then he dove for the phone, his fingers closing around it just in time before it slipped over the edge. Without hesitation, he pressed the SOS button, knowing it would alert emergency services and transmit his location. Stop this, Jason, Frank pleaded, backing away from the increasingly unstable man. The police are coming. Just tell me the truth. Alicia is dead. Nothing can be reversed. Now, hiding the truth won't do anyone any good. You don't understand, Jason shouted, his face flushed with emotion. I still have my whole life ahead of me. My business, my reputation. I can't let this ruin everything. Did you kill my daughter? Frank asked directly, his voice breaking. If you loved her, why would you hurt her? She was my only child. Jason's expression contorted. I never knew what I felt for her, he admitted, his voice strained. She should have taken care of herself better, stayed away from me. And if you had loved your daughter, you would have protected her better. What are you saying? Frank asked, horrified. You don't understand. You never knew her like I did. Jason said, his words tumbling out faster. Now he gripped the shovel tightly. Knuckles white, you didn't see the way she looked at me. She kept coming back over and over. Then why didn't you say anything when she went missing? Frank demanded. Why? Bury all this out here like a grave? She betrayed me in the end. Jason spat, his eyes wild with an emotion Frank couldn't name. With a sudden movement, Jason lunged forward again, this time knocking Frank off balance with the shovel and seizing him by the throat. Frank, older and less physically strong, couldn't break. Free from Jason's grip, he gasped for air as the younger man's fingers tightened around his neck, just as spots began to dance. In front of Frank's eyes, the distant wail of police sirens cut through the air. Jason's grip loosened slightly as he looked toward the sound. In panic, multiple police cars raced up the private drive, their sirens piercing the coastal quiet. Frank gasped for air as Jason's grip on his throat loosened in surprise. Within moments, officers surrounded them, weapons drawn. Let him go, and stepped back with your hands where we can see them. An officer commanded. Jason released Frank and slowly raised his hands, and the shovel dropped to the ground. Two officers immediately moved in securing Jason's wrists with handcuffs. While reciting his rites, Frank slumped to the ground, coughing and massaging his throat. "Are you all right, sir?" A female officer helped Frank to his feet. "Yes." Frank managed his voice raspy, "Thank you." As the officers led Jason to a police car, Frank pointed toward the freshly disturbed earth there. He just buried something there. He mentioned my daughter's name, Alicia Sanders. She disappeared 22 years ago. The officer's expression became serious. "Sanders, I remember that case. Let me get Detective Ramirez over here while a few officers moved to secure the scene." Detective Ramirez approached Frank and handed him back his phone. "Mr. Sanders, I'm Detective Ramirez. You tell me what happened here." Frank explained everything: finding the yearbook, visiting Amy, his strange encounter with Jason at his home, and how he had followed Jason to this cliff. "I know I shouldn't have followed him," Frank admitted, "but when I saw him buy a shovel and white hyacinths, Alicia's favorite flowers, something just didn't feel right." Detective Ramirez nodded. "You said he buried something here?" Frank pointed to the fresh mound of earth. "He buried a wooden box in the flowers. Before that, the wind blew some papers out of the box and he gathered them up. And he said something about Alicia holding these memories." Now, the detective motioned to a forensic team that had arrived. "Let's see what we've got." As the forensic team carefully excavated the site, Frank watched with growing apprehension. The first item they uncovered was the bouquet of white hyacinths, still fresh and pristine beneath. It lay the wooden box the lead forensic technician opened. The box, carefully revealing its contents to Detective Ramirez. Inside was a stack of papers, handwritten notes, photos, and what appeared to be printed text messages, all slightly yellowed with age. There was also a small handmade wool doll that looked like the kind children make in craft classes. "Jason just buried this," Frank explained, "but he said Alicia could have it now, which means he's been keeping these things at his home all this time." Detective Ramirez put on gloves and began examining the contents of the box. The first items were printouts of text messages between Jason and Alicia, dating back to their high school days. As the detective read through them, her expression grew increasingly troubled. "Mrs. Anders, these messages suggest that Jason and Alicia had a secret relationship during high school," she said gently. "It appears it was complicated." Frank moved closer. To see the messages revealed a relationship neither he nor Elaine had known about. According to the texts, Jason and Alicia had gone out with a group of friends once, with Jason specifically asking Alicia not to bring Amy. At one point during that outing, Jason had kissed Alicia without her consent. The messages showed Alicia's initial upset, followed by a gradual shift. She seemed drawn to Jason despite her misgivings, convinced that he just needed someone to love him and believe in him. Alicia repeatedly told Jason she believed he could change and become a better person, but Jason's responses were manipulative, using her affection without ever committing to her. This went on for nearly a year. Detective Ramirez noted, flipping through more messages. Then Alicia tried to end things. The later messages showed Alicia's growing frustration with the toxic relationship when she finally broke things off and started dating Brandon Knox openly. Jason's messages became increasingly desperate, then angry. Among the photos in the box were several that made Frank turn away in horror: explicit pictures of Alicia taken while she appeared to be restrained. The background showed a rustic interior that matched the cottage Jason had just come from, as well as various locations in the surrounding woods Detective Ramirez quickly covered these photos but turned them over to examine. The backs each one had handwriting. Jason's, they presume, scrolled across the back. One photo had the same sentence, repeated dozens of times, filling the entire back. You must still love me. You must still love me. You must still love me. Another bore. The inscription had a great time at the cliffs with you. Yours, Jay, the most disturbing was on the back of a photo, where Alicia's face showed clear fear here. Jason had written a rambling note about how he couldn't keep it together anymore, that people were searching for Alicia, and that she referred to, with a profanity, refused toe talk things out with him. The note ended with an apology that he had to kill her because otherwise they would find her and capture him, adding that she would always be in his heart, even without anyone knowing about their relationship. We'll need to question Jason about the details of how he killed Alicia, Detective Ramirez said quietly to another officer. He doesn't explicitly say in these notes as they continued to examine the evidence. Another team of officers who'd been searching the surrounding area approached urgently. Detective, we found something, one of them said, her voice grim, about 15 FT from here. There's an area where the soil composition is different. We did a preliminary excavation, and we found bone fragments. Frank's legs gave way beneath him, and he sank to the ground. After 22 years of uncertainty and false hope, the awful truth was finally emerging. The forensic team expanded their search carefully, digging in the indicated area. As the afternoon wore on, they uncovered more and more of Alicia's remains. Detective Ramirez approached Frank, who had been sitting silently, watching the excavation. Mr. Sanders, would you like us to call your wife? She should know about this. Frank nodded numbly. Yes, and please contact Amy Davidson too. She was Alicia's best friend. She deserves to know. As they waited for Elaine and Emito arrive, the detective suggested Frank might want to wait at the station, but he refused. No, I need to stay here. Muir, he said firmly. They should see this, all of it, before anything is moved. We've waited 22 years for answers. I need to see this through to the end. When Elaine arrived an hour later, her face was pale with shock. She ran to Frank, and they clung to each other as Detective Ramirez gently explained what they had found. Amy arrived shortly after, her eyes red from crying. During the drive over, the three of them stood together at the edge of the crime scene, united in grief as the full extent of what had happened to Alicia was revealed. Elaine turned to the detective, her voice shaking but determined. We want to move her remains from here. She deserves a proper burial, somewhere peaceful, not this terrible place where he left her. We'll arrange for that as soon as the forensic team completes their work. Detective Ramirez assured her it shouldn't be more than a day or two. Amy stepped closer to the bone evidence, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her voice broke as she whispered, Why didn't you tell me? Alicia, we were best friends. I could have helped. We used to talk about girls who fell for guys like Jason and laughed together. I don't understand. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the cliff, Frank, Elaine, and Amy stood vigil over Alicia's remains, finally found after 22 years of searching, waiting, and wondering. She's coming home, Frank whispered, holding Elaine's hand tightly. She's finally coming home. A week later, a small flotilla of boats gathered off the coast of Mornington, just below Whitlow Cliff. The day was unusually clear for the Oregon coast, with sunshine streaming down on the gentle waves of the Pacific Ocean. In the lead boat were Frank and Elaine Sanders, along with Amy Davidson, Detective Ron Keller, who had come out of retirement to offer his support, and Detective Ramirez, who had overseen the final resolution of Alicia's case. In the boats that followed were Alicia's former classmates, teachers, and the principal from Mornington High School. The news of Jason Murray's arrest and the discovery of Alicia's remains had spread quickly through the small coastal town, shaking a community that had never fully recovered from her disappearance. 22 years earlier, Frank stood at the bow of the boat, a small urn in his hands. After careful consideration, he and Elaine had decided against a traditional cemetery burial. Instead, they chose to release Alicia's ashes into the ocean, freeing her spirit from the place where she had been confined for so long. Today, we gather to finally say goodbye to Alicia Sanders. The minister began. For 22 years, her family and friends have carried the weight of her absence, the pain of not knowing. Today, we lay that burden down and commit Alicia's remains to the sea, where she will never again be bound or restrained. Elaine stepped forward to stand beside Frank, her hand on his arm. Alicia loved the ocean, she said, her voice carrying across the water. To the other boats, she was studying to become a marine biologist. She would have loved knowing that she'll become part of the sea she so adored. Frank opened the urn and, together with Elaine, they scattered Alicia's ashes into the water. White hyacinth followed, tossed from every boat, creating a floating garden on the surface of the ocean. Amy came forward, tears streaming down her face, and placed the worn copy of The Secret Garden on the waves. "Goodbye, my friend," she whispered. "I'm sorry I never returned your book." After the ceremony, as the boats made their way back to shore, Detective Ramirez approached the Sanders with an update on the case. "Jason has confessed," she told them quietly. "He's given us the full story of what happened." According to Jason's confession, he had kept Alicia captive in the vacation cottage for several days. After abducting her, he had been obsessed with her since their brief relationship and couldn't accept that she had moved on with Brandon Knox. He said he promised to make their relationship official if she would just break up with Brandon and tell everyone she had gone on a solo trip to celebrate graduation. Detective Ramirez explained, but Alicia refused. She told him that after years of trying to love him and believing he could change, she had finally realized he was broken beyond repair. The detective continued, her voice gentle but factual. Jason said her words hurt him deeply, and they got into a physical altercation. When Alicia tried to escape, they struggled at the cliff's edge, and according to Jason, Alicia nearly managed to push him off. In his rage, he overpowered her and struck her multiple times with rocks. When he realized she was dead, he panicked and buried her body instead of calling for help. Amy wiped away fresh tears. "I remember when Alicia started asking me about Jason, wondering if he could change. I never understood why she was so interested in him when I knew how much she disliked him. I had no idea they were secretly involved." She turned to Frank and Elaine. "I'm so sorry. If I had known, maybe I could have warned her, protected her somehow." "None of this is your fault, Amy," Elaine said firmly. "Jason was manipulative and dangerous. Alicia believed she could help him, and he took advantage of her compassion." Ron Keller, the retired detective who had spent years searching for Alicia, shook his head sadly. Since Alicia never publicly dated him, and Jason had no prior record, we focused our investigation elsewhere. Brandon Knox was our main suspect at first, given that he was her known boyfriend. At the time, Jason must have just continued with his life, and no one ever looked his way again. As the boats docked, Frank gazed back toward the ocean, where the white hyacinths were still visible, bobbing on the waves. 22 years of uncertainty had finally ended. The pain wasn't gone. It would never truly be gone. But there was a sense of completion, of closure. That evening, Frank and Elaine sat on their back porch, watching the sunset. Elaine had placed a framed photo of Alicia on the small table between them, not the formal senior portrait from the yearbook, but a candid shot of her laughing on the beach, hair wild in the wind, face alive with joy. I think we can finally move forward now, Elaine said softly, reaching for Frank's hand, not by forgetting her, but by remembering her, as she truly was, vibrant, loving, full of compassion. Frank squeezed her hand. She was so much like you. You know, the desire to see the good in people, to help them be better. And she had your stubbornness, Elaine replied, with a sad smile. Once she decided someone was worth saving, nothing could change her mind. They sat in companionable silence. For a while, their shared grief, no longer a wall between them, but a bond that had weathered the worst life could throw at them. I keep thinking about how young she was, Frank finally said, how innocent. Despite everything, she believed in the power of love to transform people. It's not a bad thing to believe in, Elaine responded. The world needs more. People willing to see the potential for good in others. Alicia's mistake wasn't in believing people could change. It was in thinking she alone could make it happen. Frank nodded, understanding the truth in her words. I just wish she had told us about Jason. Maybe we could have helped her see the danger. Well, never know, Elaine said, gently, but I think wherever she is now, she knows how much we loved her, and she knows we never stopped looking for her. As darkness fell over Mornington, stars began to appear in the clear night sky. Frank thought about the journey that had begun a week ago when he found that yearbook, how a simple note about a borrowed book had led to answers they had sought for 22 years. The mystery of Alicia's disappearance was solved, but the deeper mystery of how to live with loss remained. Yet for the first time in decades, Frank felt a sense of peace. Alicia had been found. She was no longer lost in the unknown, but part of the sea had loved free and unconfined. Frank and Elaine would continue to live, to remember, and perhaps finally to heal.